fuera presidente, honestamente, si fuera presidente, para mi gente, si fuera presidente, honestamente, si fuera presidente, para mi gente.
If I was president, I'd roll up my sleeves as I face the congregation. First thing I do is free education. And every third period, we practice meditation.
Welcome to The Radical Bureaucrat, a podcast for people who want to change institutions from the inside.
Today is Monday, April 27th, and there are a few things that are heavy on my mind today. This weekend, my wife, Naima, listened to an earlier episode of the Radical Bureaucrat podcast from March 18th, and she told me that on that day, we said there were 10 reported deaths in New York City. As of this morning, the number is 11,648. That is a tremendous loss of life that would not have happened in any other year of my lifetime. And in news around the country, Georgia and other states are moving to reopen and or have already reopened. As the data has clearly shown, this virus is magnifying existing inequalities. So the people of Georgia who are most concerned about the reopening are Black folks in Southwest Georgia. The Washington Post carried this quote this weekend from a city commissioner in Albany, Georgia, that's being hit really hard. He said, to open up businesses where it's impossible to practice social distancing, hair salons, nail salons, theaters, people are like, what? You want to put everybody in a closed room and that's supposed to be okay? For Black folks, it's like a setup. Are you trying to kill us?
Yeah, that's right. The New York Times also ran a story about University Hospital in central Brooklyn, which serves largely Black and poor patients in the eastern part of Brooklyn. And they don't have the protective gear that they need in their building, which is a story we've heard about a lot. And the building, a story we haven't heard about a lot, is literally falling apart. Hospitals in some parts of the city are the facilities themselves, are in need of repair. One doctor started a GoFundMe campaign for the personal protective equipment, PPE, that they needed. And in contrast, the story in the Times says wealthy private hospitals, primarily in Manhattan, have been able to marshal reserves of cash and capital clout to increase patient capacity quickly, ramp up testing, and acquire protective gear. At the height of the surge, the Mount Sinai Health System was able to enlist private planes from Warren E. Buffett's company to fly in coveted N95 masks from China.
Yeah. So the grief is real, and it is clearly not equally borne. So today we're going to talk to a friend of mine who just wrote a powerful and courageous piece about his own grief and about how this crisis impacted his life and his family's life. Colin Seale is the founder and CEO of Think Law, an organization that helps educators teach critical thinking to all students using real-life legal cases. He's a native of Brooklyn, and his own story of growing up and navigating the public school system directly impacts his approach to tackling educational inequity today. He's the author of a new book. Congratulations, Colin.
Yeah, congrats.
Thinking Like a Lawyer, a framework for teaching critical thinking to all students. And personally, I really have great admiration for Colin for his willingness to take risks, his intellectual curiosity, and his ability to inspire others. Colin, welcome to the show.
Welcome to the show, Colin.
Thanks so much, Sam and Abram. I'm really excited to be able to share this really important story and provide maybe a more personal context for some of the numbers that you've been mentioning as you kicked off the intro.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Looking forward to the conversation. So we used to ask our guests, how are you, just to kind of like check in. And, I still do that with friends a lot. Just try to see like, how are you actually doing before I hit you with all the stuff I want to ask you about. But then recently we've been rethinking that. And it just so happens that this weekend, The Atlantic put out this article, What to Ask Instead of How Are You? It's what to ask instead during a pandemic everyone's doing badly. We need better questions to ask. That's Ashley Fetters for The Atlantic. So instead of asking how you're doing, what we've been asking guests about is what they're grieving. This is a tough question, I know, in your case because of having read what you wrote on Medium. You wrote this great analysis, really, walking through, your anger and even taking your own sort of responsibility for your own part, right? Your own complicity in being angry at yourself, which I appreciated. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're grieving, and if you'd like to, if you feel comfortable, you can tell us about your grandmother and who she continues to be for you, and how the grieving process is going for your family.
So I think it's interesting. I think it's just maybe part of whether it's the lawyer in me or just the contrarian thinker in me, that when I see certain things like that piece around other things to ask other than like, how are you doing? I think we should still ask. I think it still matters. Like, yes, like none of us are doing like phenomenally well during the times that we're facing right now. However, we're not actually all in the same boat. This is hitting people a little bit differently. And I think that in some cases we might let ourselves off the hook if we don't actually like ask, like, how are you? Like, just have that real legit sort of personal check-in with folks. And
that connection.
All right, I'm going to debate you for a quick second, Mr. Lawyer, just in defense of the piece. So I think you're right. I actually think that like most things we're totally aligned on this. I think the point of the piece is that we often say, "How are you?" and the response is, "I'm fine. I'm good."
Yeah.
That's
not the real.
And what you're saying is really check in with people, right? I was on a call earlier today, and the facilitator was like, "Hey, how you doing? You good?" Right. Well, the answer is, "Yeah, I'm good." Right. But is there I think what you're saying is we need to really, really ask and open up the space for people to say, how are they doing?
Right. Because really, we don't really want to ask how people are. We're using it as a substitute as like, what's up? Like, hey, like we're not really trying to ask. But I think that there's value in actually having that check-in. So over the last few weeks, when people have asked me, like, how are you? I would be honest, like I'm cycling between rage and inspiration, looking at the way that some of our first responders, some of our educators, just the way people are stepping up to the table, it's super inspiring. At the same time, I am so afraid for my family in New York City. I'm so afraid of my mom who has to travel to work from Brooklyn to Manhattan every single day because her employer isn't really trying to hear that work from home thing, even though my mom is a CPA. You know what I'm saying? Like, she's a CPA. Like, she can do that work from anywhere, but like, it took until the very, very end for her to do this. And then on top of that, we've got this concern of my grandmother, Doreen Omida Seale, who passed away last Sunday at 89 years old. A few months away from her 90th birthday. My grandmother came to the United States in 1969 from Barbados. All of my family is from Barbados. Mom, dad, all my aunts and uncles. And what really struck me about thinking about my grandmother's life is, she's always been the person to take care of everybody else, to take care of herself, just remarkably independent. And when I think about her life, when I think about like what it meant 3 to 5 years ago when she was diagnosed with dementia and slowly started to require 24-hour care, being able to set herself up in a position where, as a woman who worked as a nurse's assistant in New York City, was able to essentially set up her own money to be able to pay for 24-hour medical care for 5 years. Who does that? That's my grandmother. That's that, like, that sort of can do, pull yourself up by a bootstrap mythology. Like, my grandmother was a firm believer that was like a real thing. Like, she lived and breathed this thing. So to feel like at the end of the day, the same system that she came here for, dreaming for an opportunity, the same system that she brought family members in and just had this firm belief in, the same system took her life. It really took her life. This idea that, like, even though she's been in the house for a month and a half, just the back and forth that her caretakers had to take, that my mom had to take, it opened her up to risk. And when she contracted COVID-19 on Tuesday morning, and ended up going to SUNY Downstate Hospital, where the doctors really did fight diligently. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm not sure that normally would have happened, but for the fact that one of my best friends that I happened to go to high school with, we both went to Bronx High School of Science, and he became an anesthesiologist. He had a really good, his roommate from med school was actually a high up at SUNY Downstate, and he happened to do his residency at SUNY Downstate. So literally every single doctor at every single shift he spoke to. I've never been so much in contact with doctors before. And we had an unprecedented level of access. My grandmother was treated like a VIP. So even within that, I'm struggling with this idea that, like, had my grandmother just been a random 89-year-old walking in there, I don't know that she would have made it to Sunday morning. I think that, it would have been a much shorter battle for her. But I'm really struggling with this. I'm really struggling with this concept that, like, as a nation, we are just letting so many people down. And you say those numbers, but I think it's also important to understand that in my grandmother's neighborhood, there is a church, St. Mark's Episcopal Church. It was very hard for us to get a minister for her very small burial service in New York City this Saturday morning, because in the last 2 weeks, 17 people from this congregation have died due to COVID-19 complications. So I'm like, you talk about people that are, like, poor to, just did enough to be able to retire and sustain on a very fixed income in a rent-controlled apartment.
Right.
And you're talking about 17 people that I grew up seeing at the church all the time.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
These things it doesn't just happen by accident. So, like, when we start saying these numbers, like, I think it's important to start thinking about who these people are. Living in Arizona right now, you could talk about the numbers as a state, or you could talk about what's happening at the res. You talk about what's happening at the Navajo res, you're like, whoa, like, this is madness. So this idea of us being on the same boat, like, we've got to really start thinking about, like, what those nuances look like. And it's hard. This podcast being called the Radical Bureaucrat, it really resonates with me, because if there ever was a time where radical leadership is needed, it's right now. It's right now. Because we have a lot of very questionable things going on. As I laid out in the Medium article, it's hard to run away from the logic of seeing what we knew by late January and our, like, criminal failure to act.
Yeah.
You, in the article, just to put it out there, you say in the article, I'm going between sadness and rage. And in your rage, writing was cathartic or therapeutic for you, and you really put it out there very strongly. And you went very specifically after Trump and his supporters. And at this point, I mean, it's circulated a little bit. I'm just wondering, really out of curiosity, like, how that was received, because I thought that was a really brave move, and I know that you were just
help us to calibrate. How much blowback will we get if we drop a similar targeted, well worded, well argued piece like this? What have you felt as the wave?
So let me step back for a second and recognize that when I wrote the sentence, I blame my granny's death on President Donald Trump, the millions and millions of people who voted for President Donald Trump, and its countless enablers, lackeys, and co-conspirators. I'm not going to act like just putting that out there felt perfectly, like, free and liberating. I did have a little moment of second guessing myself. And part of what I spoke about here is the fact that my grandmother was a believer in radical honesty, whether it was socially polite or not. She's a person that, like, if you happen to see her after putting on a few pounds, just don't even bother seeing her. Because she's going to tell you, you're looking real fat. And it's like, all right, that's really rude, but it doesn't even matter. She's not going to hold back. But at the end of the day, she is also going to always speak the truth. So I thought, in her memory, in her spirit, like, why not just lay it out there? And this kind of brings me back to, like, the person I was when I was in student government at Syracuse, and the person I was when, I was in my law school classrooms and we'd be having a conversation around whether it's gay marriage or affirmative action or whatever. I was like, at the end of the day, I trust my analysis of the facts. And, come for me. Like, come come? Like I don't really care. Like being in the circles that I'm in, working in schools with 30 states, we've got schools in West Virginia. We've got schools in Kentucky. Like I know that I work with a lot of educators who voted for Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
That is what it is. Like, I think that, I laid out the different reasons and categories that people fall into of like why they decided to do that. But I'm not going to sit here and act like his incompetence hasn't led to this mass pandemic. Like, I'm going to call a spade a spade. This is on him. And because you elected him, it's on you. And like, I'm not letting myself off the hook either.
Right.
I'm saying that, like, I know that I didn't do as much as I probably should have done. I really didn't. I really kind of shrugged my shoulders and said, wow, Trump is such a moron. There's no way this guy's going to get elected. There's no way. I didn't even give it any real credible thought. I didn't knock on anybody's doors and tell them to go vote. I wasn't on the phone. I wasn't offering rides to people to get them to the polls. No, I didn't do any of that stuff. So I recognize that it's not the most nuanced argument out there to say that, Donald Trump caused my grandmother's death. But at the same time, within the same week, do you know how many times somebody is texting me like, Colin, my condolences about your grandmother. My grandmother just died too, from the same damn thing. Well, what do you even say? Oh, ditto? Like, what do you even say when you see the cycle going like so deep? It's very, very hard to deal with that level of like mass trauma. So I don't know, a girl I went to middle school with and elementary school, her mom used to make like a beef patty. She had a beef patty shop right on the street on Avenue D, down the street from where I went to elementary school. She died. She's 38 years old, and she died from COVID-19 complications. And I was like, yo, like, this is like insane. I don't know a single person in New York that has not been personally impacted in their family by this disease. So like, yeah, I'm going to blame massive incompetence. Like, no, there's no way I'm going to let that off the hook. And maybe it might cause some people to think about me a little bit differently. Okay. Like, I can't ever feel afraid to say the truth. The truth, especially recognizing my privilege to say the truth. I've got a little bit of a platform. I got people that listen to me. I've rise to this, a certain level of influence within some sectors of education in particular. So why not? Why not? If my truth can inspire others to act, then it's not just a privilege. It becomes a duty. Like I have to do it.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you. That's profound. I think I'm gonna replay that part a few times. So we've seen from the data that our Black and Indigenous people of color, our Black, Native American, Latinx people, and poor people have been disproportionately impacted by the virus. Now, disproportionately is kind of fancy language for unequal, right? Proportional would be equal, parity, right? That means that different groups are making it through this differently. We've seen that in the data, those of us that have seen the data and broken it down. In that way, the virus is kind of amplifying a lot of stuff that already was there, a lot of stuff that smart people have been pointing to, with an airtight case for why for a long time. So as people who are kind of in different spots in the work to create a more equitable, a more just education system, how do we leverage this moment? We spent so much time before in circles talking about disrupting. We need to disrupt the system. We need to disrupt and dismantle. And I agree, we do. But the system is disrupted. Now what? What can we do now to change the system before it reboots on us?
So I've been thinking about this a lot, because even when we talk about right now the system being disrupted, I always scratch my head and I'm like, And yet still, within the disruption, it just hits a little bit differently. So I have my own business, minority-owned business. I've got my own deal, and I didn't get any money from the Paycheck Protection Program. A lot of big businesses that are able to get private equity funds that are able to actually be publicly traded, like somehow, some way, they were able to get millions and millions of dollars. And I know so many people of color that are owning small businesses that we claim on one hand are so vital to the United States economy. On the other hand, we just get rapidly, just like we have an open wound, and they just start like just stabbing us even more into that open wound by showing us who's actually getting access to these funds, and they're not us. And I don't even know how much data we're going to get in terms of what's disaggregated. Like, what are we even going to know about?
Well, can I jump in and give you some numbers right here? I just saw a story on CBS News
from the races of the business owners.
Yeah, the PPP loan program, right?
Okay.
Roughly 95% of Black-owned businesses, 91% of Latino-owned businesses, 91% of Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander-owned businesses, and 75% of Asian-owned businesses stand close to no chance of receiving a PPP loan through a mainstream bank or credit union.
Close to no chance? That shit should be our T-shirt. Like, right. That should be our T-shirt. Close to no chance. When it comes to anything related to, people in the United States suffering generally, we got close to no chance. If there's pain and suffering happening to people that have privilege, that people that have access, we are screwed. We are totally screwed. So this is where it starts to kind of make me sort of like think back. And I'm like, all right, maybe the answer isn't disrupting the system more than it is acknowledging the need for us to have our own systems, the need to actually acknowledge the systems that currently exist. When my family all came here, they came at a time where nobody really had access to credit. And what that meant was that they had this thing called a meeting. Other cultures call it a susu or whatever have you, but they would show up at church every Sunday and put $20 or $50 in a pot once a week. And then they would basically take turns figuring out who would get the money from the pot. If somebody had an unexpected death in the family or some sort of tragedy, like they might get moved up in the order. But this was this idea that like nobody is going to take care of us. We are here and we are all we've got.
Yep.
Yeah.
We are all we've got. And this is what pains me so much. Like, my grandmother had so much faith in this system. She had so much faith. So much faith. And I am almost like relieved of the confusion that her dementia caused for her. Because had she been clear-headed and recognized the level to which she was being screwed over, I think it would have been just a very painful way for her life to end.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that powerful word. I think the collective body, the collective Black body, as Ta-Nehisi Coates puts it, the collective Indigenous body has suffered these traumas. Even now, as you're talking, I'm thinking, I don't know. I still don't really know how things work if we don't have a system to distribute things like food and medicine and education and electricity, things that won't be distributed fairly if we don't step in and do it in a fair way. And how all of our attempts to do that up to today have failed miserably. And here we are sitting at the apex of the failure of this system, of the, all built on these kind of written corpus of documents coming out of Europe, right? So much so that if this is the end of the world, like this is the failure of the written word to establish something sustainable for generations. And we are all we've got. We've got to go back to our circles, our oral traditions, and start again and figure out how to rebuild.
And let's be real, like a part of this is understanding the way power works, right? The way that we traditionally understand power isn't always accurate. So I think a lot about learning about the young lords and learning this idea about, like, in the Bronx and Spanish Harlem, like, they weren't doing garbage collection. What do? They just threw it out in the streets. Like, all right, y'all don't want to throw it, we just throw it in the streets. You can have us having this stink trash out here in the summertime. Now y'all can't have any traffic coming by. And like that kind of action causes systems to change. It's essentially like we've got to lay our bodies down on the tracks and dare people to just run us over. Y'all are going to run us over anyway, so we might as well make a statement while we're doing it. And I think, at the end of the day, I'm not really sacrificing my life. I'm not really maybe a few people might not want to partner with Think Law or, all this guy is on some real racial stuff. All right, fine, whatever, right? So, but I'm not really like sacrificing opportunity right now. But like, I think often about like people like a John Lewis, folks who were like not just the first person in their family to go to college, but more than likely the first in that whole damn community. And what do? They say, actually, I'm going to go risk my life to make sure that people that I don't even know have a right to vote that I just got a couple of weeks ago because of my age, right? So it's just like, when you start thinking about this, when you start thinking about like, the extent to which people need to sacrifice to get the kind of justice that we deserve, the kind of access that we deserve, I don't know. I think we could all use a lesson in courage. We could all use a lesson in like remembering what it might have felt like to have that level of fearlessness, because it's been beaten out of us. Yeah. It's been sucked out of us systemically over the years, and we need it.
Yeah, we need
Colin, you are bringing so much to this conversation today, and I'm just so grateful for you sharing your story, and being so raw and real about it. We're at time, just about. Unfortunately, I would love to keep you longer, but I told you how long it'd be. We're honor that commitment. I want to ask you, in the midst of all of this, is there anything that's bringing you a sense of calm?
A sense of calm?
Calm, yeah.
It's just anything. It is like, I'm not one of those obsessively silver linings kind of people, but I think that there's this idea that, well, I'm sitting over here, sitting on my grandfather's trust fund, and somehow I deserve to be rich. And we've got these people that are busting their butts that we kind of thumb our nose at, that are like restocking groceries and like out there making sure that people have what they need. I feel like it's reframing, at least somewhat, at least on a very surface level, whose work is valuable and how do we measure that? So I think that when we start thinking about conversations around like raising the minimum wage and like, the inherent value of like people's labor, I think there'll be a lot more energy around those conversations now. And that gives me a great sense of calm and hope, that like we just don't take really hardworking people for granted because somehow we think we're better for them since our jobs. I once read it as like, the difference between people that have to shower in the morning versus showering at night. If your job doesn't require you to shower at night, you might not understand the struggle of what it looks like to really, really get in there and do the work that like our country depends upon to no end. So I think that's something that really, as someone that comes from a working class family where people busted their butts and got their hands dirty, it makes me feel like we're at a reconciliation period that should really reframe that in a positive way.
Yeah. And So I want to tell you that our last guest was your college classmate, Jose Bilson.
Is that
And
right?
you guys went to Syracuse together, right?
Yes, sir.
I thought so. So he said something similar in terms of, like not using the word silver lining, but along those same lines. The other thing that I thought you might say, and you said this in your piece, was just writing. And I think, and you also showed us how writing and speaking your truth is part of your process of dealing with this grief. And so that act, I think you've modeled it for us. So thank you for that.
No problem. Thank you all so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Colin.
And Colin, is there anything that you where can people check you out? Look for your work, look for your book,
Yeah.
just whatever you want to tell us.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, this is all fueling my obsession with critical thinking even more. My book, Thinking Like a Lawyer, a framework to teach critical thinking to all students, it actually officially drops on April 30th, so this Thursday. And then we've got my website at thinklaw.us, and you could also follow me on Twitter at Colin E. Seale to just kind of keep in touch and keep this conversation going.
Yeah, and it'll be up on the Radical Bureaucrat Twitter too, so you guys can find it there. Thanks
you
so
so much, Colin, for telling your story. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
If I was president, I'd free all my poor black and brown kids that got caught up in 3 strikes. And when they get out, they getting free bites. So they can ride to their future, not to their past. Go to the store, get some chips with no GMO. Cause my folks, we got a right to know. And if you don't know, now you know. Me gusta la lima, me gusta el limón, pero no me gusta tanta
Si fuera
corrupción.
presidente, honestamente, si fuera presidente, para mi gente, si fuera presidente, honestamente, si fuera presidente, para mi gente.
All right, Sam. So let's end like good radicals. What is one thing that you learned today that you can use to create a more just and equitable world?
I am just really sitting with what Colin brought today. And I feel like there's so many things that I'm going to have to go back and listen and really reflect. A lot was coming up for me as he spoke. I mean, I just want to start with the fact that he lost his grandmother and is honoring her. And we're talking about grief right now and how we process our grief.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about, well, this is a podcast about the workplace, and how do we do that in the workplace, and how do we create space for that? And Colin runs his organization, and he gets to, in some sense, set the terms for that. But I think that, again, like, we just need to keep creating space for people to express themselves the way that he just did.
Yeah, that can be tough. I mean, people sometimes feel like that's enough with the feeling circles. We can
Right.
go back to the real work or whatever. And I get it. I'm not anti-productivity, although my extreme skill at procrastination probably makes it seem like I am. I think we have to be willing sometimes to let ourselves get let ourselves crash with the wave, let the wave crash over us, and be, and I think that is really hard to do right now. We're in week 5 of online meetings, and we're stacked with meetings that we're not sure. We're trying our best to give what we have to give, but boy, it's hard. It's harder being in back-to-back Zoom meetings than it is going into an office. That's what I'm realizing.
Zoom fatigue is real.
And yeah, making space for grief. I tell you this, you're going to have a retention problem on your hands right now if you don't know how to allow people some way to communicate what's happening with their grief and find accommodation that works for them while they go through that grief. I think we're headed toward a place where people are really questioning their labor and what it really contributes to. And so making space for grief at work is so important. I think what I a lot of things, I agree. I think there is a lot to sit with in this story in particular, and I'm going to have to go back and re-listen. But out of the things that Colin said, I think one thing that really resonates with me is this idea of the power of living. I guess we talk about it a lot as living your values, but like, the power of showing up day after day after day for that job, right? The power of saving up, year after year, right? The power of stewarding something for the sake of your, descendants,
Yes.
the descendants of your descendants.
Yes.
That to me is the hope, is all of the hope, is the idea that there will be some meaning out of our efforts to make sense of this all. We're going to help to lay a foundation for our kids who are going to solve the problems that we don't know how to solve. At least that's what keeps me going. So yeah, very grateful for your time
and
today.
So I'm going to say something else that I thought of as he was speaking, which is when he was talking about that community chest of saving up.
Right.
I thought of Tassica Lloyd again, talking about collectivism. And again, Tassica is from the West Indies, like Colin's family.
Yep.
And so there was that sense of collectivism that they brought into their church. And he said, we're all we've got, right? And so they have that sense. But if we're ever going to get to real equity, the we has to be much broader.
Yeah.
And he was speaking as a Black man, speaking of other Black people and immigrant people. But we can't keep making the John Lewises bear the brunt of the sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
So as a white presenting person, what I'm really inspired to say is to the white folks out there, like, we have to sacrifice something. We have to put ourselves out there. And this is about a collective we, right? But there are some of us who have more privilege than others. And so it's, of course, I think it's powerful for people of color to speak to their own communities about what they have. But it's also powerful for us white folks to recognize that if we want to have the type of society that we want to live in, and if we want to have a society that really is looking out for all of us, because sometimes it's going to be us too, we have to do some of that sacrificing. We have to put ourselves out there. And Colin speaking that truth is the type of truth speaking that we have to be not shy away from, both to ourselves and to each other.
Yep.
Yeah. So, all right, before we wrap up, Abram, you want to tell them about Apple Podcasts?
Yeah, I'd love to. If you guys could rate and follow us on Apple Podcasts. If you listen to any podcast, they're constantly asking you to do this. And that's because the way that people find out about podcasts is because in the Apple Store and the Apple Podcast engine specifically, things are recommended to them. I don't know why that's the way it works, but somehow Steve Jobs figured out the future and has us all broadcasting to each other from our pods. And so we're asking you to do your part and go in and put in some stars. Even if it's not that many stars, you can leave us some critical feedback. That's okay. Help us out on Apple Podcasts. Also, you can follow us on Twitter at RadBureau, Bureau. And you can leave comments or questions there.
Yeah. Colin's piece will be up at our Twitter page or at his Twitter handle as well. So let's also end by being good bureaucrats. The views expressed here are our personal opinions and do not reflect the official or unofficial position of any government agency, policy, party, leader, or really anyone besides the two of us, and maybe you, but maybe not. This content has not been sponsored or approved by anyone and was mostly just made because we wanted an opportunity to talk about things that matter to everyone, whether they realize it or not. Thanks for listening.
Me gusta la lima, me gusta limón, pero no me gusta tanta corrupción. Me gusta la lima, me gusta limón, pero no me gusta tanta corrupción.